The crystal cities of Valora Prime burned under alien skies as Korthic warships darkened the three suns above. Ambassador Lythka pressed his thin fingers against the communication console in the underground bunker, watching the last transmission tower flicker and die on the surface monitors. The beautiful spires that had taken his people centuries to grow were cracking under bombardment, their harmonic songs of wind and light, now replaced by the screams of the dying, and the thunder of enemy weapons. Lythka was old even by Zephyrian standards, his translucent skin showing the blue veins that marked advanced age in his species. His people had never known war, never built weapons, never trained soldiers. They were mathematicians and artists, philosophers and crystal singers, who shaped matter with sound and light. The greatest violence in their recorded history had been a dispute over library funding that lasted 3 days and ended with both sides apologizing profusely. Now they faced extinction at the hands of creatures who seemed to exist only to destroy and consume. The Korthic had arrived without warning 6 days ago, their massive ships blotting out the stars. No demands, no negotiations, no mercy. They simply began killing everything that moved and claiming everything that remained. "The northern cities are gone," whispered Hila Vexqui from across the bunker, her voice barely audible through the translator device. "The sensors show nothing but rubble where the Academy of Harmonics stood for 800 years. Lythka closed his large eyes and felt the weight of failure crushing his chest. As the senior ambassador to the Galactic Council, he had spent decades building relationships with other species, learning their languages, understanding their cultures. Yet when his people needed help most, those relationships meant nothing. The Altarians had politely declined to intervene, citing neutrality policies. The Centauri Federation had expressed sympathy but claimed their forces were committed elsewhere. Even the mighty Drachner Empire, with their massive fleets, had simply ignored the distress calls entirely. The bunker shook as another explosion rocked the surface above them. Dust fell from the ceiling onto the dozen Zephyrian survivors huddled around the communications array. Most were government officials and their families, the last remnants of a civilization that had numbered in the billions just a week ago. Children clung to their parents, their usual soft chiming voices now silent with terror. "Ambassador," said Science Minister Dolan, his voice shaking, "the quantum resonance chamber is failing. If we lose it, we lose our ability to send signals beyond the system." Lythka looked at the ancient device that had allowed their world to connect with distant stars for over 1,000 years. Like everything else the Zephyrians built, it was beautiful and delicate, made of living crystal that grew stronger through harmonic vibrations. But it was never designed to function while the world above burned. "Send one more message," Lythka decided, his fingers dancing across the controls with desperate precision. "Broadcast on all frequencies, all languages, all protocols. Tell them we are dying. Tell them we need help. Tell them that innocents are being slaughtered by monsters." The message went out across the galaxy, carried by quantum waves that traveled faster than light itself. Most species would receive it within hours, though whether any would care remained to be seen. Lythka had little hope left, but hope was all they had. On the distant world called Earth, Admiral Jake Morrison was reviewing supply reports in his office at Tower Defense Command when the communication came through. The message appeared on his screen in dozens of languages, including the broken English that many alien species used when communicating with humans. Morrison read it 3 times before calling for his senior staff. The humans were still newcomers to galactic politics, having achieved faster than light travel only 50 years earlier. Most alien civilizations treated them with polite curiosity at best, barely concealed contempt at worst. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, meaning it was so hostile that most species considered it uninhabitable. The fact that humans had evolved there made other aliens view them as dangerous primitives, barely civilized barbarians who had somehow stumbled into space technology. Captain Lisa Hayes arrived first, her combat boots clicking on the metal floor of the command center. She had fought in 3 different planetary conflicts and carried scars from each one. Behind her came Colonel Rickstone, the grizzled Marine who had seen more combat than any other human alive. The rest of the senior staff filed in quickly, sensing the urgency in Morrison's voice. "We have a situation," Morrison said, displaying the Zephyrian message on the main screen. "Unknown species under attack by something called the Korthic Empire. They're asking for military assistance." Hayes studied the data streaming in from long-range sensors. "Sir, the Korthak have 60 ships in that system. We could maybe scrape together 12 if we stripped every defense platform in human space." "They're not asking us," Colonel Stone pointed out, reading through the intelligence reports. "This message went to everyone. The big powers will handle it." Morrison pulled up the response log and shook his head grimly. "Nobody's responding. Colonel, the Altarians declined. Centauri passed. Drakner isn't even acknowledging the message. As far as I can tell, we're the only ones still listening." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Earth's entire space navy consisted of 12 heavy cruisers and their support ships, barely enough to patrol human territory, let alone launch an expedition halfway across the galaxy. The crews were experienced and well-trained, but they had never faced anything like the Korthic fleet. "Sir," Hayes said carefully, "we barely know these Zephyrians exist. We've never met them, never traded with them, never even exchanged ambassadors. Why would we risk everything for complete strangers?" Morrison looked at the tactical display showing the burning cities of Valora Prime, then at the faces of his officers. These were soldiers who had sworn oaths to protect the innocent, who had fought and bled for that principle on a dozen different worlds. He thought about the children hiding in bunkers while monsters hunted them through the ruins of their homes. "Because that's what we do," Morrison said finally. "We don't abandon people who need help. Alert the fleet commanders. I want every ship combat ready within 12 hours. The staff exchanged glances of surprise and concern, but nobody argued. They had all seen enough war to know that sometimes you had to fight simply because it was right, regardless of the odds or the cost. As alarms began sounding throughout Terra. "Defense Command." Morrison opened a new communication channel to the distant world of Valora Prime. His message was simple but carried the weight of humanity's promise. "Help is coming." The shipyards around Earth orbit buzzed with activity as the largest human fleet in history prepared for departure. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the UTS Liberty, watching supply ships ferry ammunition and medical supplies to his battle group. 12 heavy cruisers floated in formation, their hulls scarred from previous conflicts but their weapon systems gleaming with recent upgrades. Each ship carried the best technology humanity could produce, along with crews who had learned warfare in the harsh crucible of their home planet. Captain Lisa Hayes commanded the UTS Vengeance, her ship loaded with enough firepower to level a small moon. The crew worked with practiced efficiency, checking weapon systems and running combat drills that had been refined through generations of human conflict. Hayes herself had grown up on Mars during the colonial wars, where children learned to shoot before they learned to read. Her gunner crews could hit targets that most alien species couldn't even detect. Colonel Danny Rodriguez led the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force aboard the troop transport UTS Thunder. His 5,000 Marines represented the finest ground fighters Earth could offer, soldiers who had survived training on worlds that would kill most aliens within hours. They carried weapons designed for creatures who had evolved on a planet where everything tried to eat, poison, or crush them. Each Marine was worth 10 ordinary soldiers from gentler worlds. Major Kate Sullivan commanded the elite orbital drop battalion, 300 specialists trained for the most dangerous missions in human space. Her troops practiced boarding actions and planet drops in conditions that replicated the worst environments Earth could offer. They could fight in vacuum, underwater, in crushing gravity, or in toxic atmospheres that would liquefy alien biology. Sullivan herself had been born during a volcanic eruption on Io and considered extreme danger to be just another day at work. Dr. Amanda Cross supervised the medical teams aboard the hospital ship UTS Mercy, preparing for casualties that would inevitably come. Her staff included trauma surgeons who had learned their trade in Earth's war zones, medics who could perform surgery while under fire, and nurses who could keep patients alive in conditions that would challenge most species' survival. They carried medical supplies designed for human physiology but adaptable, enough to help other species if needed. The preparations took 72 hours of non-stop work. Ship crews loaded everything from basic ammunition to exotic weapons that most civilizations had banned as too inhumane for warfare. Human engineers worked around the clock to upgrade shield generators and weapon systems, pushing technology beyond safe limits. Because safe wasn't good enough when innocent lives hung in the balance, Morrison received hourly updates from the Zephyrian system as the situation deteriorated. Long-range sensors showed the Korthak systematically destroying population centers while their ground forces hunted survivors through the ruins. The aliens seemed to take pleasure in prolonging the suffering, turning mass murder into entertainment. Every report made Morrison more determined to reach them before it was too late. Other galactic powers monitored the human fleet with mixtures of curiosity and derision. The Altarian Council couldn't understand why these primitive Deathworlders would risk everything for strangers. Their own culture valued survival and prosperity above all else, making heroic gestures seem like madness. They watched the human preparations with the detached interest of scientists observing an interesting but ultimately doomed experiment. The Centauri Federation placed bets on how quickly the humans would retreat once they encountered real opposition. Their military analysts calculated that the human fleet would be destroyed within minutes of engaging the Korthak armada. Some Centauri nobles actually sold tickets to observe the battle through long-range sensors, treating the coming slaughter as entertainment. Even the mighty Drachner Empire, with their reputation for military prowess, dismissed the human response as meaningless gesture. Their war chiefs had studied human conflicts and concluded that these upstart aliens might be fierce fighters on their own world but would crumble when faced with professional galactic warfare. The Drachner had conquered dozens of systems and believed they understood combat better than any other species. All of them underestimated what humans were capable of when protecting innocents. The human fleet departed Earth orbit exactly 72 hours after Morrison made his decision. 12 warships accelerated toward the edge of the solar system, their engines burning at maximum power. Behind them came supply ships and support vessels, carrying everything needed for extended combat operations in hostile space. The formation moved with precision that impressed even skeptical alien observers. Morrison had chosen his route carefully, using hyperspace lanes that would bring them to Valora Prime in the shortest possible time. The journey would take 8 days at maximum speed, pushing both ships and crews to their limits. But every hour they saved might mean hundreds of lives preserved on the distant world. The crews used the transit time for final preparations and combat drills. Marines practiced assault techniques while ship gunners ran targeting exercises against simulated Korthak vessels. The humans had studied every scrap of intelligence about their enemies, learning how Korthak ships fought and what weaknesses might be exploited. They planned for battles in space and on planetary surfaces, preparing for every scenario their experienced officers could imagine. Hayes spent hours with her tactical team, analyzing Korthak ship designs and weapon capabilities. The enemy vessels were larger and more heavily armed than human ships, but they were also slower and less maneuverable. Human ships had been designed for the chaos of Earth's early space wars, where survival depended on speed and adaptability rather than raw firepower. Rodriguez drilled his Marines in urban combat techniques and alien environment operations. His soldiers practiced fighting in low-gravity, high-radiation, and toxic atmospheres. They studied Korthak biology and psychology, learning how to kill creatures that were larger and stronger than humans, but lacked the tactical flexibility that came from evolving on a death world. Sullivan's elite troops prepared for the most dangerous missions, practicing precision strikes and hostage rescue operations. They would be first on the ground when the shooting started, tasked with protecting civilian populations while regular forces engaged enemy military units. Each trooper carried enough firepower to level a building but was trained to use minimal force when innocents were nearby. Throughout the journey, Morrison received updates from other galactic powers. Some offered sympathy for the doomed human expedition. Others suggested that Earth reconsider before throwing away its entire fleet on a hopeless mission. None offered assistance or support. The Admiral ignored them all. His ships continued toward Valora Prime at maximum speed, carrying soldiers who had volunteered for a mission that might well be suicide. They came from a world where survival meant fighting impossible odds, where evolution had shaped them into creatures capable of thriving in conditions that would destroy gentler species. On the 7th day of the journey, long-range sensors detected the Korthic fleet in orbit around Valora Prime. 60 enemy ships surrounded the planet like predators circling wounded prey. The alien vessels were 3 times larger than human cruisers and carried weapons that could crack continents. Any rational military force would have turned around and gone home, but humans weren't rational when innocent lives were at stake. They were something much more dangerous than rational. They were determined. Morrison stood on his bridge as the fleet approached the edge of the Valora system, watching his officers make final preparations for battle. In a few hours they would face odds that no other species would dare challenge. Most of them would probably die in the attempt. All ships report ready for combat, Admiral. Hayes announced over the communication system. Morrison nodded and opened a channel to the entire fleet. Today we fight for people we've never met, on a world we've never seen, against enemies who've never known defeat. We fight because it's right. We fight because someone has to. We fight because that's what humans do. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Valora system. 12 human ships against 60 alien monsters. The real battle was about to begin. The human fleet materialized at the edge of the Valora system like ghosts becoming solid, their ships dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the UTS Liberty, studying the tactical display that showed 60 Korthic vessels orbiting the burning planet. The enemy ships were massive, each one 3 times the size of his largest cruiser, their hulls covered in weapon ports that could reduce entire cities to ash. Warlord Grexthal commanded the Korthic armada from his flagship, a kilometer-long monster called the Bloodrender. When his sensors detected the human ships, he examined the data with casual interest. 12 small vessels against his entire fleet seemed like a joke, barely worth his attention. The Korthak had conquered 47 worlds and destroyed countless civilizations. These unknown aliens would be nothing more than target practice for his gunners. Unidentified vessels, Grexthal broadcast on all frequencies, his voice a grinding rasp that sounded like metal being torn apart. You will leave this system immediately or be destroyed. The Korthic Empire claims this world and everything on it. Morrison looked at his communication officer and shook his head. No response. All ships, attack pattern Delta. Target their command vessel first. The human fleet accelerated toward the Korthic armada at maximum speed, their engines burning bright against the starfield. On 60 enemy ships, weapon officers prepared to swat these insignificant insects out of space. They had fought dozens of species and never encountered serious resistance. Most civilizations surrendered after seeing the size of the Korthic fleet. Others managed 1 or 2 desperate shots before being vaporized. The humans were different. The UTS Vengeance fired first, launching a spread of plasma torpedoes that streaked across space like miniature suns. Captain Hayes had positioned her ship for maximum damage, using an attack angle that most alien tacticians would consider suicidal. Her weapons struck the nearest Korthic cruiser before its shields could fully activate, punching through armor plating and detonating inside the enemy hull. The Korthic ship staggered under the impact, its engines flickering as power systems overloaded. Grexthal roared in surprise and fury as his supposedly invincible fleet took damage from creatures he had never heard of. He ordered an immediate response, and 20 Korthic vessels opened fire on the human formation. The space between the fleets filled with energy beams and missile trails as both sides engaged at close range. Human ships twisted and rolled through the enemy fire with maneuvers that defied conventional tactics. They had learned to fight in the asteroid fields around Earth, where survival meant constant motion and split-second timing. The Korthek gunners, used to engaging slow-moving targets, found themselves firing at shadows. Commander Ryan Parker led his fighter squadron from the carrier UTS Freedom, diving into the heart of the enemy formation like predators attacking a herd. His pilots had trained in the combat simulators that recreated Earth's worst aerial battles, learning to fight in conditions that would overwhelm pilots from peaceful worlds. They swarmed over Korthek ships like angry wasps, their small size making them nearly impossible to target with heavy weapons. "Blue leader to all fighters," Parker called over the radio as he lined up on a Korthek destroyer. "These things are big and slow, hit them hard and keep moving." His squadron scattered across the battlefield, each pilot picking targets and striking with weapons designed for maximum damage in minimum time. Fighter-launched torpedoes slammed into Korthek engines, and weapon ports crippling systems faster than enemy damage control teams could respond. The aliens had never faced opponents who fought with such aggressive coordination. The battle raged for hours as both fleets maneuvered for advantage. The humans took terrible casualties as Korthak weapons found their mark, but they refused to retreat or break formation. Every time a human ship was destroyed, its surviving crew members were rescued by other vessels that risked everything to save their comrades. The Korthak couldn't understand such behavior, viewing it as wasteful sentiment that weakened military efficiency. Captain Hayes brought the Vengeance alongside a Korthak battleship that was 3 times her size, matching course and speed, while her gunners poured fire into its hull at point-blank range. The enemy ship tried to turn its main weapons on her, but she was too close for the massive guns to track. Her crew worked like machines, loading and firing with the rhythm of a human heartbeat. "Hull breach on Deck 7, her damage control," officer reported as Korthak return fire found its mark. "Casualties in engineering." "Keep firing," Hayes ordered, watching her target's shields collapse under sustained bombardment. "We're not backing down." The Korthak battleship exploded in a cascade of secondary detonations that lit up the entire battlefield. Hayes pulled her ship away from the expanding debris cloud, already searching for her next target. Around her, the space battle continued with the desperate intensity that only humans could sustain when fighting for a righteous cause. Admiral Morrison coordinated the fleet action from his flagship, watching his officers work with the professional competence that came from years of combat experience. They were outnumbered 5-1 and losing ships with each passing hour, but they were also winning. The Korthak formation was breaking apart as human tactics disrupted their traditional battle plans. "Admiral," his tactical officer called out, "enemy commander is moving his flagship toward the planet." Long-range sensors show Korthak troops massing for a final assault on the surface. Morrison studied the display and realized that Grexthal was planning to complete his genocide while the space battle continued. The Korthak ground forces would slaughter the remaining Zephyrian civilians while their fleet kept the humans busy in orbit. It was a sound tactical decision that would achieve the enemy's primary objective regardless of who won the space battle. "Colonel Rodriguez," Morrison opened a channel to the Marine commander, "how quickly can you get your people to the surface?" "Give me 20 minutes and a clear approach vector," Rodriguez responded from the UTS Thunder. "My Marines are ready." To drop, Morrison looked at the tactical situation and made a decision that would have horrified any conventional military commander. He ordered half his remaining ships to break off from the space battle and provide cover for the planetary assault. It would leave his fleet even more outnumbered, but it would also put human soldiers on the ground where they could protect innocent civilians. Major Sullivan prepared her orbital drop battalion for combat insertion as the UTS Thunder approached. Velora Prime, her troops checked their equipment one final time, knowing they were about to drop into the middle of a hostile planet, where alien monsters hunted civilians through the ruins of crystal cities. Each soldier carried enough ammunition for a small war and the determination to use every round if necessary. "Remember the mission?" Sullivan told her troops over the intercom. "We're here to protect civilians and eliminate hostile forces. The Korthak have been having their way with peaceful people for too long. Time to show them what happens when they mess with somebody who can fight back. The first wave of drop pods launched from human ships, carrying Marines toward the surface. Of Valora Prime-like meteors of steel and fury. Each pod was designed to survive atmospheric entry and hostile fire, delivering its occupant directly into combat zones where conventional landing craft would be destroyed. It was a technique that only Deathworld soldiers would attempt, but it was also devastatingly effective against enemies who weren't prepared for such tactics. Colonel Rodriguez watched his Marines disappear into the planet's atmosphere, then turned, his attention back to the space battle raging around him. His transport ship was armed for self-defense, but was no match for Korthek warships in direct combat. He would have to trust in Admiral Morrison's tactical skills to keep him alive long enough to deliver the rest of his forces to the surface. The Korthek fleet was in chaos as human ships continued their relentless assault. Grexthal had never faced opponents who fought with such ferocity and innovation. His crews were skilled and experienced, but they had grown complacent through centuries of easy victories against peaceful civilizations. The humans fought like creatures who had evolved in constant warfare, because that was exactly what they were, on the surface of Valora Prime. The first human Marines landed in the ruins of Crystal Falls, where the last Zephyrian civilians were hiding from Korthek death squads. The aliens who had terrorized peaceful populations for months were about to discover what happened when predators met apex predators from a world where everything was designed to kill. The drop pods slammed into the crystal streets of Valora Prime like hammers of steel, their impact craters smoking in the alien air. Major Kate Sullivan emerged from her pod with weapon ready, scanning the ruins of what had once been a beautiful city of singing towers and harmony bridges. Now it was nothing but rubble and death, with Korthek soldiers hunting the last survivors through buildings that had been reduced to skeletal frames. The Korthek troops were massive creatures, standing nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms that ended in razor-sharp claws. Their thick armor was designed to stop conventional weapons, and their brutal faces showed the kind of sadistic pleasure that came from centuries of unopposed slaughter. They had been stalking through the ruins for hours, torturing any Zephyrians. They found before killing them slowly for entertainment. Everything changed when the humans arrived. Sergeant Ben Turner landed his squad in the middle of a Korthek patrol that was dragging terrified civilians from a collapsed building. The aliens turned toward this new threat with casual confidence, expecting to add more victims to their collection. Instead, they found themselves facing soldiers who had learned warfare in Earth's most hostile environments, creatures who viewed extreme violence as just another tool in their arsenal. Turner's plasma rifle cut down the first Korthek warrior before it could raise its weapons. His squad moved with the fluid coordination of predators who had hunted together through dozens of campaigns, each Marine covering his teammates while advancing on the next target. The aliens who had seemed invincible against peaceful Zephyrians suddenly found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by opponents who understood killing better than they did. "Civilians secure," Turner reported as his medic began treating wounded Zephyrians. "Moving to next objective." Throughout the ruined city, similar scenes played out as human Marines encountered Korthek death squads. The aliens had grown lazy and overconfident through months of unopposed massacre, making them easy targets for soldiers who had trained against opponents that could actually fight back. Human tactics, developed through millennia of warfare against their own species, proved devastatingly effective against enemies who had never faced real resistance. Colonel Rodriguez established his command post in the remains of the Zephyrian government complex, coordinating the assault while his communications team maintained contact with Admiral Morrison's fleet in orbit. The space battle continued to rage overhead, with human ships still engaging the main Korthek armada, despite taking heavy casualties. Every minute the fleet could buy them on the surface meant more civilian lives saved. "Sir," his intelligence officer reported, "we've located the main Korthek ground base. They've set up in the old university district about 10 kilometers from here. Sensors show at least 3,000 enemy troops and some kind of heavy fortification." Rodriguez studied the tactical display showing enemy positions throughout the city. The Korthik had divided their forces into hunting parties that were systematically clearing each district of survivors. It was an efficient approach for genocide, but left them vulnerable to concentrated attacks by professional soldiers who knew how to coordinate their efforts. "Major Sullivan," he called over the radio, "I need your people to hit their command center while my Marines deal with the scattered patrols. Can you break through their fortifications?" "Give me 30 minutes in clear skies," Sullivan responded from somewhere in the ruins. "These things are tough, but they're not used to fighting. People who shoot back." Her orbital drop battalion moved through the destroyed city like ghosts, using stealth and precision to eliminate Korthik positions without alerting the main base. Each trooper was a specialist in urban warfare, trained to fight in conditions that would challenge the best soldiers from other worlds. They carried weapons designed for close-quarters combat and had the tactical flexibility to adapt to any situation. Dr. Amanda Cross landed with the medical teams in a secure area behind the front lines, immediately beginning treatment of Zephyrian survivors who had been wounded by months of Korthik brutality. Her staff worked with the efficient professionalism that came from treating trauma victims in Earth's worst conflict zones. They had seen every type of injury that sentient beings could inflict on each other and had developed techniques for saving lives under impossible conditions. "These people have been through hell," Cross reported to Rodriguez as she worked on a young Zephyrian who had lost both arms to Korthik claws. "The aliens have been torturing them for sport. Some of these injuries are weeks old and deliberately kept from healing." The revelation filled the Marines with cold fury. They had come to this world expecting to fight soldiers, not to discover that their enemies had been systematically torturing civilians for entertainment. The knowledge transformed their mission from a military operation into something much more personal. Lieutenant Chris Murphy led his platoon through the University District toward the Korthik command base, moving through ruins that showed signs of deliberate destruction. The aliens hadn't just conquered this world, they had tried to erase every trace of Zephyrian culture and history. Libraries had been burned, art galleries smashed, schools reduced to rubble. It was cultural genocide on a scale that shocked even battle-hardened Marines. "Contact front," Murphy called out as his point man spotted Korthik sentries around the enemy base. "Multiple hostiles, heavy weapons." The base was a fortress built from the rubble of Zephyrian buildings, with weapon emplacements covering all approaches. Korthik engineers had spent weeks turning the university into a stronghold that could withstand conventional assault. They hadn't planned for opponents who fought with the desperate creativity that came from evolving on a death world. Major Sullivan's assault team approached the fortress from an unexpected direction, using underground tunnels that had once connected university buildings. The Korthik had sealed most entrances but hadn't considered that humans might be willing to crawl through spaces that would terrify larger aliens. Sullivan's troops emerged inside the enemy perimeter like nightmares made real. The battle for the Korthik base was savage and brief. Human soldiers moved through the fortification with the kind of coordinated violence that had made their species the dominant predator on their homeworld. They cleared rooms with grenades and plasma fire, showing no mercy to enemies who had shown none to innocent civilians. Warlord Grexthal monitored the surface battle from his flagship while continuing to engage the human fleet in orbit. His ground commanders reported increasing resistance from unknown forces, but he dismissed their concerns as cowardice. No species had ever successfully opposed Korthik ground troops, and he saw no reason why these mysterious humans would be different. That confidence evaporated when Major Sullivan's assault team captured the communication center and began broadcasting intercepted Korthik transmissions. The reports painted a picture of systematic defeat as human Marines dismantled carefully planned positions with tactics that seemed to border on insanity. Soldiers were attacking fortified positions with weapons that shouldn't have been effective and winning through sheer audacity. "Impossible," Grexthal snarled as he watched his ground forces being systematically destroyed by a handful of alien soldiers. "No species fights like this." On the surface, Corporal Amy Johnson held a defensive position at a refugee shelter while her squad evacuated wounded Zephyrians to safety. A Korthic assault team had broken through the perimeter and was advancing on the building where dozens of civilian families were hiding. Johnson's position was exposed and under heavy fire, but she refused to retreat while innocents remained in danger. "I can hold them," she radioed to her sergeant as enemy fire chewed up the barricade around her. "Get those people out of here." Johnson died holding that position, her weapon firing until the very end as she protected people she had never met from monsters who wanted to murder them for entertainment. Her sacrifice allowed 37 Zephyrian civilians to escape to safety, including children who would grow up to remember the human soldier who died to save them. Similar acts of heroism played out across the battlefield as human Marines encountered situations where tactical retreat would mean civilian deaths. Lieutenant Murphy held a bridge against overwhelming odds to allow refugee convoys to cross safely. Sergeant Turner used his own body to shield alien children from falling debris when the building they were hiding in collapsed under bombardment. These sacrifices weren't ordered or required by military doctrine. They happened because humans who had volunteered to travel across the galaxy to save strangers were willing to pay any price to complete their mission. Each death bought time and safety for innocent beings who had never asked for help but desperately needed it. Colonel Rodriguez coordinated the evacuation of thousands of Zephyrian survivors while his Marines continued to engage scattered Korthic forces throughout the city. The aliens were fighting with increasing desperation as they realized their easy conquest had turned into a nightmare of determined resistance. Human soldiers seemed to be everywhere at once, striking without warning and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. "Admiral," Rodriguez reported to Morrison during a brief lull in the fighting, "we've secured most of the civilian population." The final confrontation began when Warlord Grexthal realized his conquest had become a disaster. His armada was reduced to a dozen crippled ships, his ground forces were scattered and demoralized, and these unknown humans continued to fight with a ferocity that defied everything he understood about warfare. In his rage and desperation, the Korthic commander made a decision that would define him as the monster he truly was. "All remaining forces withdraw to the fortress ship," Grexthal ordered through the communication system. "Prepare the planetary destruction device. If we cannot have this world, then no one will." The fortress ship was a massive vessel that had landed near Crystal Falls during the initial invasion, serving as both command center and weapons platform for the Korthic ground campaign. Inside its armored hull was a fusion bomb powerful enough to crack continents originally intended to complete the genocide after all useful resources had been extracted. Now, Grexthal planned to detonate it simply to deny the humans their victory. Admiral Morrison received word of the threat from his intelligence teams who had been monitoring Korthic communications. The enemy commander was preparing to murder everyone on Valora Prime rather than accept defeat, turning mass destruction into his final act of spite. It was exactly the kind of senseless brutality that had driven humanity to cross the galaxy in the first place. "How long until detonation?" Morrison asked his tactical officer while studying the fortress ship's position on the main display. 30 minutes, sir. Maybe less if they expedite the arming sequence." Morrison looked at his remaining ships, calculating odds and possibilities with the cold precision of a commander who had seen too much death. The fortress ship was protected by shields that could withstand orbital bombardment, surrounded by the last Korthic ground forces who were fighting with the desperation of cornered animals. A conventional assault would take hours that they didn't have. "Captain Hayes," Morrison opened a channel to the UTS Vengeance, "I need you to get as close to that fortress as possible. We're going to try something that's either brilliant or completely insane." Hayes maneuvered her damaged cruiser through the upper atmosphere, dodging ground-based weapons while her engineering teams worked frantically to keep the ship's systems operational. The Vengeance had taken severe damage during the space battle, with hull breaches on 6 decks and weapon systems operating at half capacity. But her engine still burned and her captain still had fight left in her. On the surface, Colonel Rodriguez gathered his surviving Marines for one final assault. The fortress ship was surrounded by defensive positions manned by the last Korthic soldiers, creatures who knew they were going to die and wanted to take as many enemies with them as possible. Between the human positions and their target lay a kilometer of open ground covered by overlapping fields of fire. "This is a suicide mission," Major Sullivan observed as she studied the approach routes with her surviving squad leaders. "We'll never make it across that killing field before they trigger the bomb." Rodriguez nodded grimly, then activated his communication system to address all surviving human forces on the planet. "All units, this is command. The enemy is planning to detonate a planet-killer device in less than 30 minutes. We have one chance to stop them, but it means a direct assault on a fortified position under impossible odds." He paused, looking at the faces of soldiers who had already given everything they had for people they barely knew. "No one will think less of anyone who chooses to withdraw. You've all done more than enough." Not a single Marine moved toward the evacuation zones. The final assault began with Captain Hayes bringing the UTS Vengeance down through the atmosphere in a controlled crash that would have been impossible for any pilot who hadn't learned to fly in Earth's worst storms. Her ship screamed through the alien sky like a falling star, drawing every defensive weapon away from the ground assault routes. She held her course even as enemy fire tore through her hull, giving the Marines their only chance to reach the fortress. "This is for everyone who never got the chance to call for help," Hayes transmitted as she lined up on the fortress ship's shield generators. Her words became famous across the galaxy in the years that followed. A epitaph for a soldier who chose duty over survival when innocent lives hung in the balance. The Vengeance struck the enemy shields at full power, her remaining weapons firing until the moment of impact. The collision destroyed both vessels in a cascade of explosions that lit up the horizon, but it also brought down the defensive barriers that had protected the fortress. For the first time since landing, the massive ship was vulnerable to ground. Assault Colonel Rodriguez led his Marines across the killing field while debris from the destroyed ships rained down around them. Korthic weapons cut down soldiers with every step, but the humans kept advancing through fire that would have broken any other force. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to be stopped by conventional odds. Sergeant Turner died within sight of the fortress walls, his squad's plasma charges clearing a path through enemy defenses. Lieutenant Murphy fell while placing demolition charges on the main entrance, his sacrifice opening the way for other Marines to storm inside. Each death bought precious seconds for the mission to continue. Major Sullivan led the final assault team into the heart of the fortress ship, fighting through corridors designed for creatures twice the size of humans. Her soldiers moved with the deadly efficiency of predators who had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment. They cleared each deck with grenades and determination, pushing toward the bomb chamber while Korthak defenders fell back in terror. Dr. Cross worked frantically to save wounded Marines while the battle raged around her, using medical techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible under combat conditions. She couldn't save everyone, but she refused to let any soldier die alone while there was still hope for recovery. Her teams worked in bombed-out buildings and burning vehicles, providing medical care under conditions that would have overwhelmed most civilizations. The bomb chamber was protected by Grexthal himself and his personal guard, the largest and most vicious Korthic warriors in the invasion force. They had retreated to this final position knowing they would die here, but determined to complete their mission of planetary destruction. The chamber was filled with enough explosives to turn Valora Prime into an asteroid field. Major Sullivan and her remaining troops stormed into the chamber with 20 seconds left on the detonation timer. The battle was savage and desperate, fought at point-blank range between creatures who represented completely different philosophies of warfare. The Korthak fought for conquest and domination, viewing weaker species as resources to be consumed. The humans fought for protection and justice, believing that some things were worth dying to preserve. Grexthal fell to Sullivan's plasma rifle with 10 seconds remaining on the timer. The Major threw herself at the bomb's control panel, working frantically to disarm a device she had never seen before, while enemy weapons fire filled the air around her. Her technical training from Earth's military academies gave her the knowledge she needed, but experience in desperate situations gave her the nerve to act when failure meant planetary extinction. The timer stopped with 3 seconds remaining. Sullivan collapsed against the control panel, her body riddled with Korthic weapons fire, but her mission complete. Around her, the last enemy soldiers were being finished off by Marines who had fought their way through impossible odds to reach this moment. The fortress ship fell silent except for the sounds of human soldiers calling for medical assistance and checking on their wounded comrades. Admiral Morrison received confirmation of the mission's success from his flagship, where he was coordinating rescue operations and counting casualties from the space battle. Half the human fleet was destroyed or damaged beyond repair, with casualty lists that would take days to complete. But Valora Prime was safe, its people rescued from extinction by soldiers who had traveled across the galaxy simply because it was the right thing to do. Ambassador Lithka emerged from the underground shelters with thousands of other survivors, looking up at alien skies that were no longer filled with enemy ships. The crystal cities lay in ruins and millions of his people were dead, but the Zephyrian species would survive to rebuild and remember. He watched human medical teams working to save both their own wounded and alien civilians, showing the same care and dedication to healing that they had shown to warfare. "Why?" Lithka asked Colonel Rodriguez as the human commander supervised evacuation operations. "Why did your people sacrifice so much for strangers?" Rodriguez looked at the ruins of Crystal Falls, where his Marines were still searching for survivors among the rubble. Many of those soldiers would never see Earth again, having given their lives to protect people they had never met. Their sacrifice would be remembered on Valora Prime for generations to come. "Because someone had to," Rodriguez answered simply, "and we were the only ones who showed up." The story of humanity's intervention spread throughout the galaxy within weeks, carried by survivors and witnesses who couldn't quite believe what they had seen. These primitive Deathworlders had challenged an empire that terrified civilized species, fought impossible odds without hesitation,